AKAN, West African Sacred Spaces Guide, Ghana Ivory Coast and the Living Sacred Landscape. The Sankofa bird looks backward while moving forward. The sacred grove is the forest that must not be cut. The stool is not furniture, it is the ancestor's soul made wood. The Golden Stool of Asante has never been sat upon by any human being. The libation poured on the ground reaches the ancestors tonight. Ghana, where the sacred is woven into the fabric of every festival, every stool, every carved door, every word spoken in the royal court. Ilangneti Temple Scenes, May 2012, Hang Many to Productions. Contents. Introduction, The AKAN Sacred Landscape. Part 1, Understanding AKAN Sacred Space. Part 2, The Sacred Grove. Part 3, The Stool House and Ancestral Stools. Part 4, The Golden Stool of Asante. Part 5, The Niamidua, God's Tree and Household Altars. Part 6, Sacred Sites in Ghana open to visitors. Part 7, Kumasi in the Asante Kingdom. Part 8, The Manhia Palace and Asante Royal Ceremonies. Part 9, The Grove of Asante Continent. Part 10, Sacred Festivals, Akwaside and Odwira. Part 11, Attending a Royal Durbar. Part 12, The Kente Weavers of Bomware. Part 13, Sacred Sites in the Volta region. Part 14, The Cape Coast Slave Castles, Sacred Grief. Part 15, The Door of No Return, Pilgrimage and Healing. Part 16, The Adinkra Villages, Sacred Symbol Craft. Part 17, How to Visit AKAN Sacred Spaces Respectfully. Part 18, The Libation Practice. Part 19, The Halographicity Lens, Sankofa and the Synthesis. Introduction. Ghana is one of the most accessible and most welcoming countries in West Africa for outside visitors seeking genuine engagement with African sacred traditions, a country with excellent infrastructure, a strong tradition of cultural tourism, and a government and local communities that have made significant efforts to welcome the African diaspora and international visitors to engage with the AKAN sacred heritage. The AKAN peoples, the Asante, Fante, Akwapem Akiem, and related groups, maintain living sacred traditions of extraordinary richness that are, in many dimensions, genuinely accessible to the respectful outside visitor. This guide covers the accessible sacred spaces of the AKAN world in Ghana and Ivory Coast, from the sacred groves that must not be cut to the royal stool houses, where the ancestors' souls reside, from the Akwaside royal ceremony to the libation practice that any visitor can learn and perform. It also covers the Cape Coast slave castles, perhaps the most powerful sacred sites in all of West Africa, not for their ancestral AKAN theology, but for their role as the point of departure for the African diaspora, making them pilgrimage sites of extraordinary significance for anyone with African heritage anywhere in the world. Understanding AKAN sacred space. AKAN sacred space does not take the form of a single designated building in the way that a Hindu temple, a Shinto shrine, or a Buddhist monastery does. Sacred space in the AKAN world is distributed across the landscape, in specific groves that must not be touched, in specific trees that are understood as the seats of specific spiritual forces, in the household's ancestral stool, in the chief's palace where the sacred regalia of the lineage are maintained, and in the specific places where libation is regularly poured. Types of AKAN sacred space. The sacred grove, specific forested areas designated as sacred, inviolable spaces where no tree may be cut, no animal killed, and where the spirit forces of the land concentrate. These groves serve as biodiversity reserves, water catchment areas, and sacred spaces simultaneously. The stool house, the repository of ancestral stools, the sacred objects in which the souls of deceased chiefs and important ancestors are understood to reside. Access is restricted to senior priests and specific royal officials. The chief's palace, the palace of the chief, is simultaneously a political center, a sacred space, and the physical location of the community's most important sacred objects and ancestral connections. The household shrine, the household sacred space, including the Nyame Dua, the household ancestor shrine, and any specific Obosum shrines maintained by the family. The Obosum shrine, specific shrines for specific spiritual forces, rivers, mountains, or other natural features that are understood as the seats of powerful Abasum. These shrines may be simple cairns of stones, specific trees, or dedicated structures. The sacred grove of the forest that must not be cut. Sacred groves are among the most distinctive and most ecologically significant features of the AKAN sacred landscape. Specific areas of forest designated as inviolable sacred spaces where no tree may be cut, no animal killed, and where the spirit forces of the land are understood to concentrate and dwell. Sacred groves in Ghana range from tiny remnants to substantial forest patches of several hectares. They are found throughout the AKAN regions and among other Ghanaian peoples, including the Yu, the Ga, and the northern peoples. Ghana's most famous sacred grove, the Tano Sacred Grove near Tekemen in the Brongahafo region, is associated with the Tano River Obosom and has been maintained as inviolable for centuries. The conservation significance. Sacred groves have proven to be among the most effective conservation mechanisms in West Africa. The religious prohibition on cutting trees and killing animals within the grove has preserved biodiversity in areas where the surrounding landscape has been completely deforested. Many sacred groves contain species of trees, plants, and animals that have disappeared from the surrounding agricultural landscape. The sacred and the ecological are not separate in the AKAN grove tradition. The spiritual recognition that certain forests must not be touched is simultaneously the ecological wisdom that certain habitats must be preserved. Visiting a sacred grove. Approach, contact the local chief's palace or the local government cultural office before visiting a sacred grove. Most sacred groves have a caretaker whose permission is needed before entering. The offering, a small gift, palm wine, schnapps, or a monetary contribution, is the appropriate approach offering. Ask the caretaker what is needed. The prohibition on cutting. The primary sacred law of every sacred grove is that nothing may be cut. No branch, no leaf, no plant. Even picking up fallen material should be done with acknowledgement and permission. Silence. Sacred groves have a specific quality of presence, a density of life, and a quality of spiritual concentration that is perceptible in silence. Spend time in genuine quiet. The spring. Many sacred groves are organized around a sacred spring or stream. The water of the grove spring carries the obism's presence. Touching it, drinking a small amount with permission, or simply sitting near it is the most direct form of contact with the grove's sacred force. The stool house. The ancestor souls made wood. The stool house is the most sacred building in any AKAN community, the repository of blackened ancestral stools, each representing a specific deceased chief or important ancestor whose soul continues to inhabit the stool after death. The sacred stool. The stool in AKAN culture is the primary symbol of sacred authority, ancestral power, and the connection between the living and the dead. Every chief has a personal stool, carved specifically for them, in a shape that communicates their identity and role. Their stool is blackened with a mixture of soot, eggs, and other materials, and transferred to the stool house, where it becomes the material locus of the deceased chief's continued ancestral presence and the focus of regular ancestral offerings. The Akwasade ceremony, described in Part 10, is the regular ceremony at which the ancestral stools are brought out, libation is poured, and food and drink offered to the ancestors whose stools they are. This is not a symbolic remembrance. In AKAN understanding, the ancestors are genuinely present at the ceremony, genuinely receiving the offerings, and genuinely capable of blessing or withholding blessing from the community depending on how properly the relationship is maintained. Stoolhouse access. The stoolhouse is not publicly accessible. The stoolhouse of any AKAN community is restricted to the senior priests and specific royal officials who are authorized to enter and to perform the ancestral offerings. Outside visitors, including non-AKAN Ghanaians, do not typically enter the stoolhouse. What you can observe? The Akwasade ceremony brings the ancestral stools out of the stoolhouse for the public ceremony. Visitors can observe the ceremony without entering the stoolhouse itself. Understanding the significance. Even without entering a stoolhouse, understanding what it contains and what it represents transforms the encounter with AKAN sacred tradition. The stoolhouse is the physical infrastructure of the ancestor relationship, the material form of the community's ongoing connection with those who came before. The Golden Stool of Asante, the soul of a nation. The Golden Stool is the most sacred object in the AKAN world, and one of the most sacred objects in all of Africa, the physical embodiment of the soul of the entire Asante nation, called down from heaven by the priest Okomfo Anoke in the late 17th century to unite the Asante peoples under the first Asantehene, Ose Tutu. The stool has never been sat upon by any human being, not even by the Asantehene himself. It has its own throne beside the Asantehene's throne. It is carried in its own palanquin, attended by its own attendants, treated with the protocols appropriate for a being of extraordinary sacred power. When the British governor demanded to sit on the Golden Stool in 1900 as a demonstration of British sovereignty over the Asante rose in immediate armed revolt, the War of the Golden Stool led by Ya Asantewaa, the Queen Mother of Ejisu. The Golden Stool is not on public display. It appears at specific royal occasions, carried beside the Asantehene, draped in golden ornaments, attended with the full ceremonial protocol of the most sacred object in the kingdom. Seeing the Golden Stool at a royal durbar is one of the most significant sacred experiences available in the AKAN world. Sacred sites in Ghana open to visitors. Major accessible AKAN sacred and cultural sites: Kumasi, cultural capital of Asante, the heart of the Asante Kingdom, the Menhia Palace, the Kujetjia Market, the cultural center, and the Asante traditional buildings. Bonwire, the village of origin of Kente cloth, where the traditional Kente weaving tradition is maintained by master weavers. Visitors can observe the weaving and purchase directly from weavers. And Tonso, the primary Adinkra cloth-making village, where traditional Adinkra stamping with calabash stamps carved with specific Adinkra symbols is demonstrated and practiced. Cape Coast and Elmina, the coastal slave castles, now UNESCO World Heritage Sites, where the transatlantic slave trade was administered, sacred sites of grief, of memory, and of diaspora pilgrimage. Lake Basumtwi, Ghana's only natural lake, a sacred lake of the Asante, associated with the god Twai and with the belief that the souls of the dead must cross it. Surrounded by sacred groves and traditional fishing communities. Larabanga Mosque, not AKAN but Ghanaian, the oldest mosque in Ghana, built in the distinctive Sudano-Sahelian architectural style, a sacred site of the Muslim communities of northern Ghana, Kumasi and the Asante Kingdom. Kumasi is the second largest city in Ghana and the capital of the Asante Kingdom, the political, spiritual, and cultural center of the most powerful and most sophisticated pre-colonial state in the region. The Asante Kingdom at its height controlled much of present-day Ghana through a combination of military power, sophisticated diplomatic relationships, and the sacred authority of the Asantehene and the Golden Stool. Kumasi today is a vibrant, chaotic, beautiful city where the ancient Asante sacred traditions are maintained alongside modernity, where the Asantehene still holds court, where the Akwasade ceremony still gathers the sub-chiefs in their regalia, where Kente cloth is still woven in the traditional way in the surrounding villages, and where the Adinkra symbols still communicate their philosophical teachings on cloth and wall. Kumasi visitor highlights: the Menhia Palace Museum, the official residence of the Asantehene, a guided museum attached to the palace, provides excellent historical and cultural context. The museum includes royal regalia, historical artifacts, and information about the Asante Kingdom's history. The Asantehene himself occasionally meets with significant visitors. Ordinary tourists visit the museum only. The Kumasi Cultural Center, a complex of craft workshops, galleries, and performance spaces, kente weaving, wood carving, batik making, and other traditional crafts are practiced and available for purchase. The quality varies, asked to see the master weavers work specifically. The Asante traditional buildings, 6 Asante shrines in the Kumasi region, are UNESCO World Heritage Sites, the finest examples of Asante shrine architecture, characterized by their distinctive geometric mud relief decorations. Some are still functioning shrines. Visitor protocols should be discussed with the site caretaker. Sacred festivals, Ekwaside and Odwira. The AKAN sacred calendar creates a continuous sequence of ceremonies, and several of the most important are genuinely accessible to outside visitors who arrive with proper preparation and proper respect. The major AKAN festivals. Ekwaside, the most regularly occurring AKAN sacred ceremony, the Sunday Ade, the day when the ancestral stools are formally honored. At Manhia Palace in Kumasi, the Ekwaside ceremony brings the paramount chief and his sub-chiefs together in full regalia for the ancestral stool ceremony. The ceremony is partially open to visitors. The outdoor courtyard portions are generally accessible. The inner stoolhouse ceremonies are not. Dress modestly, observe from the designated visitor areas, do not photograph without assessing the situation carefully. Odwara, the most important of all AKAN festivals, a week-long purification and renewal ceremony in which the community cleanses itself of the previous year's accumulated spiritual pollution and renews its relationship with the ancestors and with Naime. The Odwara period begins with mourning and concludes with celebration and the sharing of new yam. The specific days and access protocols vary by community. Homoa, to hoot at hunger, the GA people's harvest festival celebrating the end of a historic period of famine. Traditional food is prepared and shared with both the living and the dead. Accra's GA communities maintain active Homoa celebrations that visitors can respectfully observe. Panafest, the Pan-African Historical Theatre Festival, a biennial event organized around Cape Coast and Elmina that brings African diaspora visitors together with Ghanaian communities for cultural exchange, ceremony, and collective engagement with the history of the slave trade. Attending a Royal Durbar. The Royal Durbar is the most spectacular and most publicly accessible sacred ceremonial event in the AKAN world, the formal gathering of the paramount chief and all sub-chiefs in the ceremonial courtyard, with full regalia, processional music, and the formal exercise of royal authority that is simultaneously political and sacred. The Royal Durbar, what to expect, and how to behave. The visual experience, the AKAN Royal Durbar, is among the most visually extraordinary events on earth. The Asantehene and his sub-chiefs arrive in their full ceremonial regalia, elaborate kente cloth robes, gold ornaments covering hands, wrists, and neck, specific ancestral swords and staffs, and umbrellas of specific sizes and patterns that communicate the specific rank of each chief. The processional music fills the space. The seating, visitors to a royal durbar are typically seated in a designated area, often in stands or on chairs in the outer courtyard. From this position, the full ceremonial sequence is visible: the procession of sub-chiefs, the arrival of the paramount chief, the formal exchanges, the libation pouring, and the ceremonial dances. Photography is generally permitted at royal durbars from the visitor areas, but always observe what others are doing and follow the lead of local observers. Specific moments may not be appropriate photography. Come dressed with respect, clean, modest, and ideally in some acknowledgement of the occasion's importance. Bright colors are appropriate and welcomed. All black is associated with mourning and is not appropriate. The libation, if you witness libation being poured, the controlled dripping of schnapps or other spirits on the ground while the ancestors' names are called, stand quietly and receive this moment with full attention. The ancestors are being called. The moment is genuine. The Cape Coast slave castle's sacred grief. Cape Coast Castle and Elmina Castle, the two primary slave trading fortresses on Ghana's coast, are among the most powerful and most difficult sacred sites in all of Africa. They are not AKAN sacred sites in the traditional sense. They are the sites of one of the greatest crimes in human history. But for the African diaspora, and for anyone who acknowledges the reality of what happened there, they function as sacred sites of grief, of memory, and of the determination to reckon honestly with the past. What happened here? Through the dungeons of Cape Coast Castle and Elmina Castle, approximately 12 million enslaved Africans were held in conditions of extraordinary brutality before being loaded onto ships for the Atlantic crossing. Many died in the dungeons before they could be transported. Those who survived passed through the door of no return, the gate in the castle wall through which they walked onto the slave ships, knowing they would never see their homeland again. The door of no return as pilgrimage site. The door of no return at Cape Coast Castle has become one of the most significant pilgrimage sites for the African diaspora, particularly for African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, and Afro-Brazilians who visit Ghana to engage with their ancestral heritage. The specific experience of walking through the door of no return, now sometimes walked from sea back into the castle as a return ceremony, is a powerful ritual of ancestral acknowledgement and the honoring of those who suffered. Visiting Cape Coast and Elmina. The guided tour, both Cape Coast Castle and Elmina Castle, offer guided tours that take visitors through the dungeons, the governor's quarters, the church, and the door of no return. The tour guides are excellent, deeply knowledgeable and emotionally honest about what happened in these spaces. The ceremony, visiting the castles with ceremony, with specific prayers, specific offerings, specific acknowledgement of the ancestors who suffered there, is the most appropriate approach for practitioners who understand their visit as a sacred pilgrimage rather than a historical tour. Flowers, libation, and silent prayer before the door of no return are all appropriate. Panafest, the biennial Pan-African Historical Theatre Festival held at Cape Coast, includes specific ceremonies of ancestral acknowledgement and diaspora connection at the slave castles, a powerful collective ceremonial engagement with the sites. Emotional preparation, these sites are not places to approach lightly. The scale of suffering that occurred in these dungeons is palpable. Visitors consistently report being overwhelmed emotionally, regardless of how prepared they thought they were. Give yourself time before and after. The door of no return pilgrimage practitioner who carries African heritage, whether directly or through the Yoruba Lukumi tradition, the Kandambo tradition, the AKAN tradition, or any other African-rooted practice. The door of no return at Cape Coast Castle is the most important pilgrimage site in the world. Any threshold through which the tradition's continuity was most severely threatened, and its survival on the other side of that threshold is the greatest testimony in any tradition to the resilience of genuine sacred knowledge. The ancestral acknowledgement. A ceremony, a tea, the door of no return. Preparation, bring a flower. Bring libation, palm wine, schnapps or water. Bring your full attention and your full emotional availability. The approach, walk through the dungeon toward the door slowly. Acknowledge the specific people who walked this path before you, millions of specific human beings, with names, with families, with sacred practices that the Middle Passage tried to erase and that survived anyway. A tea, the door. Stand at the threshold. Look at the ocean. This is the last view of Africa that millions of people had. Spend at least 5 minutes in silence here. The offering, pour a small amount of libation on the ground or into the sea. Speak the names of your known ancestors, however far back you know them. Then address the unknown ancestors. To all whose names I do not know, I acknowledge you. I remember you. I carry what you preserved. The flower, place or cast the flower into the sea. The return, if the tour allows for the return ceremony, do this. To return through the door of no return is to complete a circuit, to honor the journey and to bring back what was taken. After, give yourself unscheduled time after visiting the slave castles. This is not an experience to rush from toward the next activity. The Adinkra village's sacred symbol craft, the Adinkra cloth-making tradition of the AKAN peoples, the stamping of specific Adinkra symbols onto cloth using carved calabash stamps and specific ink, is both an ancient sacred practice and a living craft tradition that can be directly experienced and engaged with in specific villages near Kumasi. Ntonso, the Adinkra village. Location: Ntonso is a small village approximately 20 kilometers northwest of Kumasi, easily accessible by shared taxi from Kumasi's Kedietia station. What you will see, Master Adinkra craftspeople who have dedicated their lives to the tradition will demonstrate the complete process, from the preparation of the black Adinkra ink, to the carving of the calabash stamps, to the rhythmic stamping process that covers the cloth with specific symbol arrangements. What you can do: most Adinkra craftspeople at Ntonso welcome visitor participation. You can try the stamping process yourself under their guidance. This hands-on engagement with the symbols, feeling the specific form of each stamp, pressing it into the ink, placing it on the cloth, is a completely different experience from reading about the symbols. The sacred dimension, the Adinkra symbols are not merely decorative, each one encodes a specific philosophical or sacred teaching. The craftsperson, who has spent a lifetime working with these symbols, has a relationship with their meanings that goes beyond intellectual understanding. Ask about specific symbols. The conversations that result are often the most valuable part of Ntonso visit. Purchasing Adinkra cloth purchased directly from Ntonso craftspeople supports the tradition directly and authentically. The cloth is used for ceremonial occasions, particularly funerals, where specific Adinkra patterns have specific meanings about death, mourning, and the continuation of life. How to visit AKAN sacred spaces respectfully. The respectful visitors code for AKAN sacred spaces. Greet the chief first when visiting any AKAN community, particularly for festivals, ceremonies, or access to sacred sites. The correct protocol is to seek an audience with the local chief to introduce yourself and explain your purpose. This is not bureaucracy. It is the correct relational approach that communicates respect for the community's sacred authority. The Okimi, the chief, does not typically speak directly to visitors. The Okimi receives your greeting and communication and transmits it to the chief. When you speak to the chief, speak to the Okimi. When the chief speaks to you, the chief speaks to the Okimi, who transmits to you. This indirect protocol is the sacred speech practice of the AKAN royal court. The Okime's role is to beautify and appropriately frame all communication. Dress appropriately. Bright colors are welcomed at festivals and ceremonies. Avoid white. Black is appropriate for funerals and occasions of mourning. Modest coverage is expected at sacred sites. The schnapps, the standard offering in AKAN sacred interactions, whether pouring libation, paying respects at a chief's court, or approaching a sacred grove, is a small bottle of schnapps. Carrying a small bottle of schnapps communicates that you have come prepared to give, not only to receive. Remove shoes when entering a chief's palace reception room or a specifically designated sacred space. You may be asked to remove your shoes. Always comply. The libation practice, how any visitor can participate. The libation practice, pouring liquid on the ground while calling the names of ancestors and spiritual forces, is the most fundamental and most accessible sacred practice in the AKAN tradition, and it is genuinely available to any sincere outside practitioner. How to pour libation, AKAN style. What you need: schnapps, palm wine, or clean water. Schnapps is the most traditional. Water is always appropriate when alcohol is unavailable or inappropriate. The setting: any significant occasion, the beginning of a ceremony, the beginning of a meal, the approach to a sacred site, the honoring of an ancestor can be marked with libation. The more significant the occasion, the more appropriate the libation. Step 1, hold the bottle or cup. Hold the vessel in the right hand. Step 2, call Naomi first. Pour a small amount as you speak. Naomi, creator, source of all things, I pour this in your honor. Step 3, call the abossum. Pour again. Abasum, spirit forces of the rivers, the mountains, the sacred groves, I acknowledge your power and pour for you. Step 4. Call the ancestors. Pour as you name each ancestor whose name you know, from the most recent backward. For those whose names are not known, Nananom Ensamanfo, great ancestors of my lineage, I pour for you. Step 5. Pour for the occasion. State what the libation is for. I pour as I begin this ceremony, this visit, this day. Step 6. Close. Pour the remaining liquid. So be it. Madars. The frequency in traditional AKAN life, libation is poured before every significant meal, before every ceremony, at the new and full moon, on ancestors' death anniversaries, and at every significant life transition. The more regularly you pour, the more alive the practice becomes. The halagricity lends Sankofa and the synthesis. The AKAN sacred tradition's most important contribution to halagricity is the Sankofa principle, the recognition that it is not wrong to go back and fetch what was forgotten. Every deep dive in the halagricity library is a Sankofa act. Every tradition recovered, every practice restored, every sacred language reclaimed from the margins of Western cultural dominance. This is Sankofa. The bird looks backward while moving forward. The wisdom retrieved is brought into the present. The Adinkra and Halagric sacred symbol. The AKAN tradition's centuries-long practice of using specific visual forms as philosophical languages, each Adinkra symbol a teaching that can be read, contemplated, implied, is the most developed ancient parallel to what the Halagric symbol practice does. The tetralty symbol encodes the foundational Halagric teaching in visual form, just as each Adinkra encodes its specific teaching. The Adinkra tradition shows what it means to take symbols seriously as a living philosophical language rather than a decorative element. The libation and the Halagric ancestor practice. The AKAN libation practice, pouring liquid on the ground while calling the ancestors by name, thanking them for their continued care, informing them of the family situation, and asking for specific blessings, is the most completely articulated model in West Africa of the Halagric ancestor altar practice. The AKAN do this before every significant meal, before every significant undertaking, at every significant occasion. The ancestor relationship in AKAN life is not a special practice for special occasions. It is the daily, practical, relational foundation of sacred life. Connection to halagricity. Se wo wafina wasankofa a yenki. It is not wrong to go back and fetch what you forgot. The AKAN proverb names what halagricity is doing at its most fundamental level, the synthesis of traditions that were separated by the violence of colonization and Western cultural dominance, the reclamation of sacred practices that were pushed to the margins, the restoration of the recognition that the divine is not the property of any single tradition, but is present wherever genuine seekers have honored it with genuine devotion. Every guide in this temple series is a Sankofa journey. Every tradition visited is a tradition remembered. Grand Rising. Say wo with fino wasankofa a yenki. It is not wrong to go back and fetch what you forgot. A calm proverb the Sankof's teaching. The bird looks backward while moving forward. The Adinkra symbols speak their teachings on every cloth, every carved door, every royal umbrella in Kumasi. The ancestors are present at every libation, waiting to be named. The sacred grove holds its trees inviolate. The golden stool holds the soul of the nation. Pour libation, call the names. Walk into the door of no return and come back through it as a promise. What was taken will be remembered, what was forgotten will be fetched. Grand Rising. Holgricity Temple Series, or Halignity Aura Q Production, May